Good evening, and we're here at Exodus Unveiled, our third installment, Parshat Bo. And this week's Parsha is the final breaking of Pharoh and of Egypt. The three last plagues will fall upon them, and Pharaoh will succumb, and we will have the story of the Jewish people being prepared to leave Egypt. And this is truly the out of Egypt story, and all of the directives concerning around the seder, which they did in Egypt, and which they will be told that they will do in the future as well. So the Egyptians were broken by the plagues, and at the beginning, before we saw that over and over, Moshe was saying, in order for the Egyptians to know that I am God. And here now we will have a change, because Moshe is going to say, in addition, so that you and your children and your children's children will see my signs and know that I am Hashem, know that I am God. So here we have a new element, that the unfolding of the plagues, which we mentioned, took over 10 months, saw the crushing of the greatest empire in the ancient world, was not just for the Egyptians, but to teach the Jews a lesson as well, and the children and children's children as a hint at the seder, which will be the foundation of Jewish life. So Moshe and Aaron go to Pharaoh. They tell him that a swarm of locusts is going to come upon the country if he doesn't send the Jews out. And this time the servants of Pharaoh speak up, and they say to Pharaoh that we should send them out or we will be destroyed. They try to talk some reason into Pharaoh. Of course, we're going to see it doesn't succeed, but Pharaoh is willing to listen. So he says to Moshe, well, who's going to go? And Moshe says, our children, our elders, our men, our women, everyone's going. And he says, Ra will be in front of you. Rashi says that there's a planetary sign, which is a bad omen in front of you, according to the Midrash, or that this will be bad for you if you do this. And Paro refuses. And so Moshe raises his staff, and the wind comes all night, all day and all night, and the next morning, swarms of locusts like have never been seen before in Egypt. Now, there's an interesting discussion here, because the wind brought them in, and when Moshe gets them to leave, the wind will bring them out. So was this a natural phenomenon? So the Torah is careful to say, specific to say, that we've never seen anything like this, and never will there be in the future. So there we see that even a seemingly natural, potentially natural event was a supernatural one as well. And after the locusts come and devastate the country, eat any food that was left after the snow and that came and destroyed it, after the hail, Pharaoh then says, as he did earlier, I have sinned against God, and he adds, and against you. And he asks Moshe for forgiveness, and asks Moshe to plead to God to take them away. And the plague is taken away, and of course, it says, and for the last three plagues, it will say, Pharaoh that Hashem hardened Pharaoh's heart, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them out. We talked last week about how the different understandings of this, either to not let Pharaoh do tshuva because he was so evil and his intentions were only because to save his skin, or God hardening his heart is because Pharaoh dug himself so deep he no longer had free will. So those are some of the explanations. Number 9, darkness. It says that darkness was palpable. Is this like a fog? Rashi explains that it was darker than regular night. Once again, you might say, well, it's just stayed night for 7 days. No, it was a supernatural element. And they couldn't see for 3 days, and it says they couldn't move. So the Midrash says 3 days they were blinded. There was complete dark. and for 3 days they were frozen. So that's the 6th day. On the 7th day, Paro pleads. And it says specifically as well that the Jews had light. Remember, starting at the 3rd plague, the plagues were not smiting the Jews. And then Pharaoh calls to Moshe. I guess he's calling because he can't move. And he tells him, you can go and your children, but you cannot take your flocks. And Moshe says, not only going to take our flocks, you're going to give us animals. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And Pharaoh says, I will no longer see you. And if I do, you will die. And Moshe reiterates that you will not see it. Of course, Pharaoh is going to call him for after the plague of the firstborn. How do we understand that? We can talk about it. Some people say that you won't see it of my accord. But if Pharaoh calls Moshe, Moshe is going to respond. So the 10th plague, the plague of firstborn. And God tells Moshe, there's one more plague, then you will be going out, and the Egyptians will give you their silver and gold, and you'll find favor in their eyes. In other words, not only are we forcing them out, they're going to turn, they're going to change. They're going to look favorably on you. And it says there as well, an incredible statement, Moshe was great in the eyes of Egypt and the eyes of Pharaoh's servants and the eyes of the people. So it seems at this point, it's only Pharaoh who is holding out, driving home the point we made last week, that Pharaoh represents the Yetzer Hara, represents the lower voice, represents pure ego. He could not give in because of his ego. And then it says, and really what we see is that everyone recognized that the God of Israel and his people were the ones who were the most powerful here. And like the evangelicals today, who want to do good for Israel because they know we're God's people, so too the Egyptians seem to have a change of heart. And but not enough for Pharaoh. So then Moshe tells the people, this final plague is going to come. The Egyptians will bow down to us and we will go out. But first, he's going to tell them that they have to do something. And this is the famous section of declaring the new month. He says, this is a new month for you. According to Rashi, it's the first mitzvah giving to the people in the Torah. And the rabbis understand from it that each month the high court declared the new month upon seeing the new moon. And then they're told what they need to do. Now, if you think about it, for 10 months, God asked nothing of the Jewish people, right? All they had to do was sit back and watch Egypt be brought to his knees. And you'd think at this point, they're going to go free. God's going to say, take up your pitchforks, turn on the Egyptians. You're going to have to now stage a revolt. Judaism believes that we couple our belief in God with action, as we're going to see next week, at the Red Sea. But it's interesting. What does Moshe tell the people to do? So God gives the mitzvah. He says, on the 10th of the month, you go take a lamb, bring it to your home, and then the 14th, you're going to slaughter it in the afternoon. You'll put the blood on your door frame, and then you'll eat the meat roasted with matza and more. So what is God asking them? So we need to understand what Nachmanides says, that according to the Egyptians, the lamb was a god. It was deified. We saw in Genesis, it was an abomination to eat meat, to eat lamb in front of the Egyptians. So these slave people was being told, take the God of your masters, bring it into your house for 3-4 days. And of course, Mr. Egypt is going to walk by the Jewish home. And, Yossi, what are you doing with that lamb? Oh, I'm going to slaughter it in 3 days. And Shabbat HaGadol, the Shabbat before Passover, commemorates the miracle that the Egyptians did not turn on the Jews. But the Jews had to stick their necks out. They had to take the chance. And then it says, take the blood and put it on your doorposts. Now, this is very interesting. It does say, in order that I should see and be a sign for me, God said, and I will see it and pass over your houses. And that's where the word Pesach comes from, to pass over. But we have to ask an obvious question. Doesn't God know which are the Jewish houses and which are not? And like all mitzvot, it's not for God, it's for us. So the Jews were being told to take another step, to take the blood and splatter it, so to speak, in your face of the Egyptians, right? Not just slaughter the animal, not just eat it, but throw the blood on the door. And so the Jews were being forced to, in a sense, overcome their slave mentality. They were being forced to do a spiritual revolution. They were being forced into spiritual activism, which was asserting their belief in God and their trust that God would protect them. And it says Leil Shimurim. It's a night of guarding. And so at the seder, we open up the door for Eliyahu and we leave it open all night. Depends where you live, but even in Manhattan we did. And although we had a guard downstairs, so it was somewhat safe. But it's a night of guarding. And so they were promised that they would be protected. But they had to take that action. They had to take a stand. They had to choose which side they were on, and there was no going back. And then the first of 3 times this is going to be reiterated. God tells Moshe, tell the people, this is going to be a holiday for all generations. And when you come into the land, your children will ask you, what are you doing? And you'll tell them. You'll tell them the story. So it says as well that 7 days you'll eat matzah. You will get rid of all leavening. The first and the last days are a holiday. You cannot do any creative activity except for cooking and the food you need during the holiday on those 2 days. Now, there's an interesting question, is that on Passover, we get rid of all bread. What did they do in Egypt? It says they ate the matzah, they ate the Passover lamb with matzah and maror. So today we eat matzah, maror, and we use romaine, and then we put the charoset on it to give it a little taste. The Hillel sandwich, theirs was a true sandwich with a piece of matzah folded over and lamb, maror, matzah. So in Egypt, though, the rabbis tell us there was no prohibition of leavening, no prohibition of eating bread yet at that point. What did they talk about that night? Not the story of a Passover, but I guess their expectation that they were going to be going. And with the self-conscious realization that this was going to be an event memorialized in Jewish history. And Moshe reiterates that you will guard it for the future when you come to the land. Okay, the night of the plague itself. So midnight hits, and it says there was no house that was not struck. And Pharaoh calls Moshe, says to them, go out and go and bless me too. Get a blessing for me from God. And it says, the Egyptians even pressed the Jews to leave, and he uses the same language as he uses to harden. V'yichazek. Paralleling, they hardened their hearts. God hardened their hearts. Now they're hardening, they're pushing for the Jews to leave, measure for measure. And the people took their dough before it was risen, carrying it on their shoulders on bundles. And if you move around dough, as you might know, it doesn't leaven, right? A cake, you move it around, the whole thing collapses. And it says then a few lines later, and once they had left, they baked the dough, the matzot, because it did not rise, because they were driven out and they couldn't wait, and they had not prepared provisions. Now, there's a number of questions on this. First of all, what we see from here is, what is the main symbolism of matzah? The main symbol of matzah is the bread of freedom. We begin the seder with, this is the bread of affliction. Later on in the Torah, it will call him lechem oni, the bread either of poverty or of speaking, answering many questions. But here it's the bread of the quickness of leaving. And that's what we have in the seder. We eat the matzah, but actually Maimonides' version of the Haggadah starts with, we left Egypt quickly, and this is the bread of affliction. So it mentions both symbolism. And when right before eating the matzah, we point and say, this is the matzah, we say that didn't have time to rise. So the matzah is not just about remembering slavery. It's also about remembering how quickly God saved us and the trust that at any time God can save us in a moment's eye. So why didn't they have provisions? Also very strange that they had to bake this on the run. They had to grab what they had. So was it a lack of trust? God had promised them they were going to leave the next day. So here's the point. They thought, we'll leave the next day. What did they do in ancient societies? They didn't have preservatives or plastic bags. They baked their bread every morning. So they would knead it at night, and the bread would rise, and they'd bake it at dawn when they woke up. But here by dawn, from midnight to dawn, they were making preparations, running around, and then they were pushed out. So they grabbed the dough, which was rising. They didn't have provisions because they thought they had another half day or so, or at least mid-morning, to get everything together. And it says they also took the silver and gold of the Egyptians, vishalum, which in Hebrew might mean they borrowed. And all of the commentaries ask this: if they borrowed it, doesn't that mean they have to return it? Some say that as they're about to ask, the Egyptians gave it to them before they even borrowed it. Some say that vishalum could mean to ask for, not to borrow. Interestingly, the Egyptians actually brought up in the UN that the Jews should pay reparations for all of the silver and gold they took when they left Egypt. And of course, the answer to them was, well, then you pay reparations for all the years of servitude. So that silenced that discussion. They left Egypt, it said, 600,000 men and their families, of course. They went from Ramses to Sukkot, and it says 430 years they were in Egypt. And we're not going to go through the whole chronology, but the rabbis tell us they were actually slaves in Egypt for 210 years. They were slaves 80, 90 years. They were in Egypt 210 years. They were, from when Abraham was told you will be slaves in a land that is not yours, was 400 years, and 430 years was, 400 years was from the birth of Isaac. He was told you and your descendants will be slaves in a land that isn't theirs. And 430 years was from the covenant when God made the promise to Abraham. So they go then at the end of the Parsha, it goes to the laws of Passover again, adding some elements. That to eat the Passover lamb, you have to be circumcised. That there's a law to sanctify the firstborn, because the Egyptian firstborn were killed. All Jewish firstborn were going to become what are today the Kohanim. And today we have a ceremony called redeeming the firstborn. If there's a firstborn son, that is the first birth of the mother without any miscarriages, then we do a ceremony where after 30 days we call the Kohen, and the son is, so to speak, redeemed, bought back, and the Kohanim become the servants. But the idea is that because God took the Egyptian firstborn, we dedicate our firstborn. So, because it's showing gratitude to God that the final plague set us free. And again, reiterating to remember this day, and the mitzvah of remembering the going out of Egypt, it says, tell your children, tell them the story, that's on Passover. But every day there's a mitzvah of remembering the Exodus, which we do in the last paragraph of the Shema. It says they went out in the month of Aviv, which is the spring. And that's why we have every 2.5, approximately out of 5 years, or 3 out of 5 years, 2 out of 5 years, we have a leap month, so that Passover should always remain in the spring, because the lunar calendar is shorter than the solar. So every year Passover gets earlier. This year it's end of March, and then the following year it's going to be bumped back to mid-April. So that based on this, that it says it has to be in the spring. The Muslims, Ramadan, they do not do this, and so Ramadan goes through the whole yearly schedule, each year being a week or a week and a half earlier. And finally, the Parsha ends saying that this event, you make it a sign on your hand and a mark between your eyes. And that is the mitzvah of tefillin. Once again, that this event is to be remembered for posterity, for the Jewish future. And when we get to the Ten Commandments, we'll talk about why that's so central. It's to remember God took us out of Egypt. That's how God introduces himself, not I'm God who created the world, because the Exodus really cements the belief that God is running the world. It was a testimony in front of the entire Jewish people. And that's the biggest message that we should take out of the whole Exodus story. Shabbat Shalom, and have a good evening. Good evening, and welcome to Exodus Unveiled, third chapter, and part 2. We're now going to do tonight a more in-depth question. And the question we're going to be addressing is, how do we know that the Exodus happened? And a number of years ago, 7, 8 years ago, one of the most prominent conservative rabbis got up in a synagogue before Passover, Rabbi David Wolpe, and he said, folks, sorry to let you know the truth, but the Exodus never happened. Now, how could it be that a prominent rabbi got to that place? And the question is, do we have evidence of the Exodus outside of the Torah? And because that question was a lingering one, historians, even some rabbis, wanted to lean to the side to say that, well, since we don't have the evidence, we have to question whether it even happened. And in history, there is a big dilemma. Is absence of evidence of absence? In other words, if I have absence of evidence, I don't have archaeological finds that show me evidence, does that mean the event never happened? Can I assume that? And the fact is that there are many different historical events that do not have strong evidence, archaeological evidence of having happened, but are described in literary texts or in history books, and historians accept them as fact. The Celts migrating to Asia Minor, the Slavs in Greece, the Arameans going across the Middle East, even conquests like Anglo-Saxons in Britain in the 5th century. Very little evidence of that. Arabs coming into Palestine in the 7th century. Very little archaeological evidence. And yet it's accepted as fact in the historical canon. So why all of a sudden does the Bible become disqualified as a historical text? And what we're going to do is we're going to delve deeper, in fact, show what evidence there is, because there's not a lack of any evidence. And we'll also deal with some other interesting questions. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And some of the other background questions and picture of Egyptian history around the time when the Jews were there. So let's look at, first of all, the larger historical picture that is depicted in the Torah and see how that lines up. So in Egyptian history, particularly around, now we call this the Middle Kingdom, and we're looking at the middle of the 2nd millennia BCE. So around the 1500s, 1400s, 1200s BCE in Egypt, and there were migrations of people from the north. In fact, they became so strong that at one point the Hyksos invaded and took over the empire. And this actually corresponds with Exodus 1:10, where the Egyptians were concerned. They said, if there is a war, they will join our enemies and fight against us, driving us out of the land. Who would the war be against? The tribes, Semitic tribes from the north who were coming into Egypt. And it's understandable that they would think maybe these Hebrews would ally with them. Those immigrants who came tended to settle in the Nile Delta, which is the area of Goshen, where Jacob and his sons were settled, and the Jewish people then grew into a people and lived. And the other thing to point out is that these immigrant peoples coming from the north in Egypt were all referred to as Asiatics. In other words, they didn't distinguish ethnically from the different ones. So people say in the United States, oh, there's immigrants from South America. They're not distinguishing Colombians from Uruguayans, from Central Americans. So they were bundled all together. Now, the other parallel, which has actually a archaeological source, is, and this is from Professor Malamed from Hebrew University. He identified a papyrus from the year 1250, which says, distribute grain rations to soldiers and to the Habiru who carry stones to the great pylon of the great city of Ramses. Okay, the Habiru could that be Hebrew, Ivri? And even if it's referring to a larger ethnic group, this corresponds exactly to what the Hebrews were doing. So first of all, I have to break the news to you. I'm very sorry to tell you that we did not build the pyramids, despite what the pictures in your childhood Haggadah might show you. The pyramids were built approximately 1,000 years before the Jews were enslaved in Egypt. And the pyramids were not built by slaves. On the other hand, if you even look at the picture behind me, you'll see a picture of bricks being made. You see there, the slaves building the bricks, picking them up. Oops, I just got lost here. And we also have pictures of taskmasters pushing the workers. Now, were those slaves? Were those Hebrews? Also, many of these slaves tend to have a darker complexion. And is that because they're out in the sun? Is that because they had a darker complexion than the Egyptians? There's a big tumult now over Gal Gadot being cast as Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, who is much later in Egyptian history, actually wasn't even Egyptian. She was Macedonian from the area of Greece. So the movie studios were lambasted for casting an Israeli as an Egyptian, as an Arab, when Cleopatra wasn't Arab. So, so the whole question of ethnic origin is a complicated one, but suffice it to say that there were people coming from the north. There's possibly even a text that identifies the Hebrews. So Exodus 1:11 tells us the Israelite built the cities of Pitom and Ramses. Now, we know that at the time, King Ramses built an enormous administrative area called Pi Ramses, built from mud brick, which is what is described the Hebrews working with, not carved limestone like the pyramids were built with. And could Pi Ramses be Pitom and Ramses? And it does correspond to this time period. Now, who was the Pharaoh of the Torah? And this question has always bothered me, because why does the Torah just call him Pharaoh? I mean, certainly now we call, we talk about President Biden, we talk about leaders by their names. However, interestingly enough, who isn't referred that way very often? The Queen of England. She'll just be called the Queen of England. So in ancient Egypt, Paro was known as Paro. They did not adopt their name, even though they had names, but it wasn't commonly used to identify them, to praise them. in those contexts. So even that, we're going to show that some of the usages of even of language and of the terminology and of the Egyptian realia corresponds in the Torah to what was existing then. According to this, and many historians do want to identify the Pharaoh of the Exodus as Ramses II. More about that in a minute. Now, another way that we identify the authenticity of the Torah's account of the Jews' stay in Egypt, because that's what we're doing. We're really showing, first of all, the dating of the Exodic story going back to the period, to that same period, even though many biblical critics will try to argue that the Torah was written much later. We're going to give evidence that it was written as a contemporary document. That's the first point. The second point is that we're going to find parallels between in the biblical text and in the biblical account to realia of the Egyptian time. So some of the terms used, we see that God takes the Jewish people out with yad chazaka uzro netuya, with a strong arm and a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Kind of interesting term, and I always chalked it up to kind of what I call biblical English or biblical imagery and usage. But very interestingly, the pharaohs were described as having a mighty hand and carrying out acts with an outstretched arm. And this is what we could call cultural appropriation. Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed looks at and recognizes that there are times the Torah is responding to, speaking within the context of the world that the Jewish slaves knew in Egypt. So he identifies certain commandments to take the Jews away from the practices of the Egyptians. Nachmanides points out that the Passover lamb that is slaughtered was deified, and it is the astrological sign of the month when the Jews left Egypt. So kind of nullifying the Egyptian belief in the lamb being a god, and in the month of Aries having power over the Jews. So this is the cultural parallels and appropriation. So the terms used for the Pharaoh. Another striking one, which has been pointed out by biblical scholars years ago, is that there is a very famous event that happened in the times of Ramses II, which was the battle at Karnak against the Assyrians, their enemy. And it's almost as if it was an account of Pearl Harbor, although the Egyptians won, so Battle of the Bulge. And it was represented in numerous hieroglyphics and numerous images throughout Ramses's building campaign, which was extensive. In that imagery, which you can see actually in the British Museum, the bas-relief were moved there is a picture of Ramses's camp. And his camp has striking parallels to the camp that the Jewish people set up upon leaving Egypt, to the tabernacle, as it's called, the Mishkan, the portable temple. First of all, the camp itself around it is made up of an area twice as long as it is wide. The entrance is to the east, all paralleling the Jewish camp. The smaller enclosed area with a roof within that camp is proportionate 3-to-1, its length to its width, which is the same as the Jewish camp. It had 2 rooms, an outer reception room and an inner tent for the throne, where you met the king, which would parallel the actual building of the tent of meeting in the Jewish camp, where you had the outer room, which had the menorah and other implements, and then the inner room, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the inner sanctuary, which had the ark, which is in a sense where you met the king, where the divine presence was, where the high priest went in once a year. And the other parallel is that he had 4 divisions of soldiers camped around the camp in the 4 directions, north, south, east, west. So striking parallels between the camp. Now, how do we understand this? So the Torah is appropriating the cultural known usages, architecture of the time, and putting it within a Jewish divine sanctified purpose, right? And this is an interesting question. Is there a unique Jewish aesthetic? Probably not. King Solomon brought in craftsmen from Lebanon to build his temple. And the styles that are identified from that are parallel to Middle Eastern styles of the neighbors, of the neighboring peoples. Now, to continue along these parallels with Ramses battle at Karnak, we also have a song of celebration that was written where the troops break ranks at the sight of the enemy. Ramses asks for divine help, and he's told to move forward to victory. Parallels to the Shirat Hayam, the song by the sea that Moshe composed after the splitting of the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army. In both accounts, there are corpses floating in the water. Afterwards, they offer a victory hymn that talks about the strong arm and attribute the source of strength and salvation to greater power. And the enemy is described as being consumed like chaff. Now, this poem was widely circulated at the time, but not afterwards. So how would Israelites, hundreds of years later in the land of Israel, know about such poems? So here we have another parallel. Now, another fact stated in the Torah is that it says God did not lead the Jewish people along the direct route, the way of the kings to the land of Israel, lest they encounter resistance and turn back. And sure enough, there's archaeological evidence of encampments along the coastal road, which they did not do. They went down into the Sinai Peninsula. So all of this is larger context, but you might still ask, well, is there direct evidence? Professor Malamat, we mentioned, quoted the Hapiru. He also identified a mountain in the southern Negev that had certain inscriptions. Now, people ask this. They ask, what about, if you had 2 million Jews traveling through the Sinai desert, where's the evidence? And as we said before, nomadic movements of people, nomads, train themselves not to leave behind evidence because they can be tracked if they do and attacked. Also, most of the archaeological remains from the ancient times, certainly they wouldn't be carving stones, but most of them, the daily archaeological remains are earthenware vessels. Nomads tend to not want to carry earthenware vessels with her heavy, and the Torah even describes them using skins as vessels to hold liquids. So it's not surprising, once again, that we do not have direct archaeological evidence, but Professor Malmat wants to identify certain rock drawings and paintings that have boxes with 5 lines in each box, in 2 boxes, a squiggle and a line. The box and the 5 lines, you'd imagine, is the tablets with the 10 Commandments. The line and the squiggle is the staff and the snake. Interesting possibility. Can we prove it? Not clear. We do have 2 other interesting direct archaeological mentions. The first is the Mernefta stela, which is an Egyptian clay tablet, which was composed after the Egyptian victories to the north. And it says specifically, Ashkelon is carried off, Gezer is seized, and this is the important one, Israel is laid waste. So we know that shortly after the Exodus period, we do have identified the people of Israel in the land of Israel in the 1100s, in the 12th century BCE. And that is direct, factual, tangible evidence. The other piece of evidence is a very fascinating one. People often ask, well, what about the plagues? What about the 10 plagues? So there is a papyrus that was found. By the way, one of the other archaeological challenges is that most Egyptian documents which were written on papyrus no longer exist, that they disintegrated into the desert, and we only have the stone inscriptions, which were the royal descriptions of their great battles over their enemies, not of slave rebellions leaving. But here's the Eputer papyrus. Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. What is with our water? What is with our happiness? All is ruined. Trees are destroyed. No fruit nor herbs are found. The plague of locusts specifically describes that. All the animals, their hearts weep. The cattle moan. We know that particularly the animals were struck. And so here we have glaringly parallel descriptions to the plagues of Egypt. Now, the dilemma with the Eputer papyrus is that the dilemma here is that it's dated to a later date. It's dated to the 1500s BCE, about 300 years earlier. And this is a big matter of debate in the Egyptian historical record. And by the way, a great source for all of this material is Professor Joshua Berman, Rabbi Professor Joshua Berman, who wrote a book, Ani Maamin, I Believe, the historical setting the arguments for the historical arguments of the Torah and refuting biblical criticism. So he points out an interesting point, that when it comes to historical records, many of the ancient records have mythic descriptions of events happening that might be supernatural. Now, we believe that the Torah's descriptions are not mythic, that they might be supernatural and miraculous, but that they were divine miracles. But whether you believe that or not, many of these other works, even if people don't take their mythical dimensions at face value or literally, they respect the historical accuracy of the rest of the work. When all of a sudden it comes to the Torah, people want to say, I don't believe in the miracles, and I don't believe in the historical accuracy of any of it. Now, do we have even evidence for some of the miracles of the plagues? So there's a big debate about dating Egyptian history. And they have a list of kings, but the lists are not all consecutive. So even the dates of some of the Egyptian kings, we cannot necessarily parallel to our Western dating. Now, many of these lists and the dating of them are drawn from Manetho. Manetho was one of the main Egyptian historians, but he lived 1,000 years later. Yet historians will rely upon Manetho for the sorting out the dates and the lists of kings. But lo and behold, Manetho also describes and accounts as history the exodus of the Hebrews and the Israelites from Egypt, the slave rebellion. So part of it is accepted, part of it isn't. It is questionable when historians will pick and choose what they want to take out of a text, especially based upon their biases. And we know religion can be a very loaded issue. But if we want to try and be objective about it, we do have, as we have seen, we do have evidence of the Exodus from the larger background picture that the Torah depicts, which parallels what we have learned from Egyptian history and texts, from usage in the Torah, which parallels Egyptian usage of language, of imagery, and even from specific Egyptian texts that mention Israelites or perhaps even Hebrews. So there you have it. For me, it's always fascinating to look at the larger historical picture. And the final postscript is, even the Jews coming into the land of Israel, archaeologists have recognized that around the 1200s, there was a systematic destruction of many cities in Israel, Chatzor, Beit El, and I visited Chatzor, and it was very fascinating because there's a museum across the city, it's in northern Israel, and across the road there's a museum. And in the museum, you have these two large blocks of stone with a lion face on the front. And apparently what happened is they found one that was smashed, yet these stones are on either side of the gates usually. And the second one, they only found much later, buried deeper. And the theory is that when the Israelites came, the Torah tells them to destroy the idolatrous images that they find, that the local populations had time to take one of them down and hide it, the other one they did not. But even Yigal Yadin, who was a secular Israeli archaeologist, recognized that many of these cities had widespread destruction around the year 1200s, which would have been the period of Joshua entering the land of Israel. So we hope in the future to address some of the evidence we've found from the land of Israel, which of course would not be from the 5 books of Moses, but would be from the rest of the books of prophets and the Torah. So stay tuned for that. Have a Shabbat Shalom. And we hope you found this interesting and has widened our perspective on the historical accuracy of our Exodus story.